In 1848, labor protests became so intense that Queen Victoria had to retreat to the Isle of Wight for her safety.
This was in response to Chartist protests. According to Merriam-Webster, Chartism includes the principles and practices of a body of 19th century English political reformers advocating better social and industrial conditions for the working classes.
Elizabeth Gaskell's first novel, Mary Barton, set against the Chartist rebellion, is sympathetic to impoverished workers' poor work conditions in northern industrial centers. Charles Dickens was impressed with her work and hired her to write her next novel, published in a series in his weekly journal, Household Words. Today, we will explore Victorian cotton production's impact on society and the world of Gaskell's novel by addressing three key concepts:
Industrialization, class, and gender identity.
In Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. We will briefly explore three academic journals that address these concepts in the novel: Susan S. Camick's You've Made Him What He Is, Irish Laborers and the Preston Strike in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, The Female Visitor and the Marriage of Classes in Gaskell's North and South by Doris Williams Eliot, and Women, Cloth, Fluff, and Dust in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South by Elodie Neuville.
How cold and harsh it is here. I think God has forsaken this place. I believe I've seen hell. It's white. It's snow white.
Beginning with Industrialization, Camick's literary criticism of the book North and South examines Gaskell's views on complex labor relations in England after industrialization. Her piece discusses the Preston strike, wages, workers' conditions, and the role of the immigrant Irish workforce in England. The first thing we learn in Camick's article is how the Preston strike, that lasted from October 1853 to May 1854, influenced Gaskell's work. This event occurred when workers who had accepted a 10 to 20% pay decrease read about prosperity in the industry and demanded that their pay cut be restored. Mill owners joined forces and formed the Preston Masters Association, and on September 15th, locked the mill doors in multiple cities so workers could not get in. The strike also brought to light poor working conditions and the fact that many workers were starving.
According to History Today, demand for English cotton fell when the Nian and Taiping Chinese rebellions led China to reduce their imports from 98 million yards of cotton to 41 million. According to the book 10% and No Surrender, the Preston strike closed the Preston cotton industry for 7 months and disrupted production in many other towns in Lancashire. Strikers toured the country to organize support and raised £100,000. Considering the exchange rate and inflation, that is nearly $4 million today. The Masters ended the lockdown by recruiting workers from Belfast workhouses and hiring new workers from Manchester, Yorkshire, and the South, while strikers survived on donations from townspeople. When another depression in trade hit, the strike ended in failure when strikers agreed to go back to work and accepted a pay cut. Gaskell introduces the unrest of workers in her novel through the eyes of Margaret. She looked around and heard the first long, far-off roll of the tempest, saw the first slow-surging wave of the dark crowd come, with its threatening crest, tumble over and retreat at the far end of the street, which a moment ago seemed so full of repressed noise, but which now was ominously still.
Irish workers play a prominent role in both the 1853 Preston strike and the fictional 1856 Milton strike. Gaskell exposes English and Irish tensions and addresses Ireland's status and rights in the United Kingdom. Camick's article states that through her depictions of Thornton and Higgins' evolving perceptions of culpability for the Irish situation in Milton, Gaskell critiques policies that led to marked inequality for Irish citizens and official lack of acknowledgement for their growing predicament. In both strikes, master and workers closed ranks against the Irish, but Camick argues that Gaskell shifts the responsibility for strikes from the Irish to the masters.
Differences between the strikes are that Preston's strike ends non-violently, while Milton's ends in a riot, and Preston's Irish workers stayed after the strike ended, while Milton's Irish workers were turned out. Now we're going to pause the video to discuss this question. Gaskell chose to change the real outcome of the Preston strike in her novel to include violence and the expulsion of Irish workers. Why? How do Thornton, Boucher, and Higgins represent different elements of social unrest and English-Irish tensions? Moving on to class. Gaskell's inclusion and development of middle and lower class characters creates conflict and opens up a broader view of real-life struggles in the Victorian era. Whereas other Victorian authors like Jane Austen have their characters go from drawing room to ballroom, Gaskell is not afraid to point the lens at grungy sites inspired by her city, Manchester.
In this novel, cotton is used to highlight not only the geographic disparities between the North and South, but also the cultural ones. When Miss Hale first arrives in Milton, she is shocked to see cotton in every direction she looks. Cotton represents a new way of life to which she will have to adapt. When considering the lower class, Novel notes that neither Bessie's body nor her home benefits from the finished product of the material she's transforming. The kind of wrapping, dressing, and protection which cloth can afford does not exist at the Higgins lodgings. This further denotes that cotton, as a product, is linked to wealth and empire.
Cotton, and its working into cloth, acts as a baseline for all classes in this novel. When Margaret goes on her first errand in Milton, she's overwhelmed by the amount of mill workers walking the streets. As girls walk home from the mill, they touch Margaret's shawl and comment on the exact material of her clothing. There was such a simple reliance on her womanly sympathy with their love of dress and on her kindliness that she gladly replied to these inquiries as soon as she understood them and half smiled back at their remarks. Class does not hinder the girls on the street from touching Margaret's clothing, but shows the commonality between them.
Novel states, this absence of decorum almost comes as a relief to Margaret from the affected London manners she had to submit to while at her Aunt Shaw's. Freedom she enjoys in the streets of Milton and the inescapable proximity with factory workers are two sides of the same coin. In touching her shawl or gown, the girls break down a formal barrier that language more often than not builds up. Cotton takes on a medium for which a female's character and personality is communicated. Additionally, due to the mill workers' constant contact with cloth through sewing, embroidering, and knitting, the clothes they create and then wear creates a semantic connection between their work and end product.
The relationship between classes is also portrayed through Margaret and Bessie's friendship, which also carries over to her interactions with other working people. Bessie's desire to be buried in Margaret's clothing indicates the power of cloth in their friendship and the way it creates a tie between classes.
Here again, the bond between the two girls is not based solely on words, but relies heavily on touch, mediated once again by cloth. As she was reaching her death, Bessie lay back silent and content to look at Margaret's face and touch her articles of dress with a childish admiration of their fineness of texture.
In this context, women play a vital role in the newly defined social sphere in which women take on a mediating role through philanthropic visiting. Eliot writes that North and South helped to construct this social sphere and to claim it for exemplary women visitors like Margaret Hale and for women novelists like Gaskell. In the mid-19th century, one major project of what I am calling the social sphere was to heal the separation between class and class, which is the great curse of British society. In North and South, Margaret acts as this mediator between classes to forge a bridge of understanding between Mr. Thornton and Mr. Higgins. Part of Gaskell's vision in writing this novel was for Margaret's mediation between groups to serve as a model of social action for women and men.
Now we're going to pause the video to discuss these questions. In what ways are different classes interdependent on each other through cotton? How does Margaret's philanthropy to Bessie contrast with Mr. Thornton's interactions with the working class? We will conclude with gender identity. Class and setting have a huge impact on the role of women in Gaskell's work. While the biggest literary shift for male roles is the inclusion of lower-class workers and participation in violent uprisings, historically, men were increasingly granted the right to vote and demanded better conditions from their masters. The literary leap for female characters is that female servants like Dixon and lower-class workers like Bessie are now well-developed characters, rather than just acting as a part of the setting to facilitate the upper class.
Newville's article argues that cotton represents femininity and its clash against the new modernity of the industrial lifestyle. Dress evolves from a display to impress men into an outwards expression of personality. At Thornton's dinner party, Margaret wears a large Indian shawl, which hangs about her in long, heavy folds, and which she wears as an empress wears her drapery.
Mr. Thornton sees in Margaret an authority uncommon among his peers. He internalizes her regal qualities, which highlight how different Margaret is compared with the ladies in his nouveau riche circle. Cotton is significant because of the way clothing transcends Margaret to a higher class outwards appearance. Margaret breaks down social barriers of different classes through her dress.
Novel notes that the novel's treatment of cloth follows and develops the seeming opposition between North and South, or men and women, for cloth is both an industrially transformed product and merchandise and the basis of a homelike and private occupation.
While most people agreed that women visitors were necessary to harmonious class relations and to the smooth functioning of society, few would have actually advocated women's intervention in industrial class relations. Yet intervene is exactly what Margaret does. Although her initial effort to ward off violence by protecting Thornton is seen by most of the characters in the book as inappropriate and misguided, in her less public social role as a visitor, Margaret does replace class conflict between Thornton and Higgins with personal contact.
According to Eliot, when Gaskell has Margaret teach Thornton that he can initiate such personal contact with his employees in their homes as well as in the workplace, she is using Margaret as an example of women leading a movement of social management from their own experiences with the poor in their homes rather than in workplace scenarios. This concept is an essential part of Gaskell's social vision.
Eliot also offers an insight saying, since women visitors were so vital to the work of the social, investigating, managing, and mediating relations between classes, it is not surprising that male professionals were anxious, not only about what good or harm female visitors might do, but also about female competition within the social sphere.
Now we're going to pause the video to discuss these questions. In what ways do you think women are competing in the social sphere that are threatening to men? How do you think this impacted the suffrage movement?
These articles have shed light on the cotton industry's impact on industrialization, class, and gender identity.
If you would like to read an 1853 article, The Preston Strike Meeting of Spinners, from the Liverpool Mercury newspaper,
Learn more about Elizabeth Gaskell,
watch videos on the Industrial Revolution and workhouses,
or explore research articles and museum exhibits relevant to North and South,
please visit our website provided on the handout. All academic journals can be found through the Furman Library database, and videos are available on YouTube.
Thank you.